arugula come from? We had no arugula when I was growing up. My mother never said, John, I want you to go out in the garden and pick some arugula. I'll be right back, Mom. Tomatoes, cucumbers, arugula? Yeah. It's a pretentious, horrifying vegetable. People serve just so they'll look fancy and elegant. It's the emperor's new clothes of vegetables. People don't want to speak up. Spit it out at the table. What are you serving me? It's arugula. It works with the rest of the salad. Yes, it does. The bitter with the dirt taste makes me grateful for the rest of the salad that I would ordinarily hate.
Good morning. It's Thursday, Delta Force Thursday, July the 13th, and this is The True Conservative. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the Serenity Prayer and the patriotic song of the day, we will have Cult of Neutrality, Mika Brzinzski, Rep. Marjorie Taylor Greene, Loeren Boebert, Newsmax, Articles of Impeachment, Rob-Schmitt, No Free Lunch, The Rape of the Mind, and Delta Force. All that and more when I get back. God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen.
Ladies and gentlemen, please remain standing and remove your hats for the national anthem of the United States of America.
Thank you. And now there's no free lunch. 250 Economic Truths by David-Bahnsen.
Capitalists are motivated not chiefly by the desire to consume wealth or indulge their appetites, but by the freedom and power to consummate their entrepreneurial ideas. George Gilder. Anyone who has spent any time with a serial entrepreneur knows this to be true. That while the profit motive and quality of life considerations drive ambition to a degree, they can't hold a candle to the innate desire to act, produce, create, and grow. The delivery and execution of an idea is at the heart of successful entrepreneurship, and profits merely follow. Somewhere in all of this will be consumption, yet fundamentally the driver of entrepreneurship is always the combination of the vision, dream, and passion of the entrepreneur.
And that was There's No Free Lunch by David-Bahnsen. Back in a minute. Thank you. So who is the true conservative? He is the person that has the courage of his convictions and is confident in what he knows. He is the person that understands that culture trumps politics. He's not selfish, but minds his own business. He does not go looking for trouble. He is alert. He curbs his curiosity, and he acts like an adult. He is patriotic and uses common sense. He is judgmental and moralizes. He refuses to speculate, speaks clearly and definitively, and is not afraid to say no. He's open-minded, asking why, rather than why not. He is consistent, credible, and influential, not ashamed of his existence, unafraid to learn or correct his mistakes. He is a normal American, and he is better than the socialist. He's a better friend, father, brother, family member, and a better person, period. You have to know that being a true conservative is best, or you are wasting your time. Back in a minute.
I think his staff needs to own his age. I'm just going to be honest. I don't think they do a good job helping out the president. And I'm not talking about it like, I'm just saying, if you are managing a president's schedule and you are managing a president getting on stage and getting off stage and getting on planes and getting off planes, and yes, he's 80. You need to be there for him, and you need to make a pathway. And you sure as hell better make sure he doesn't fall on a sandbag. And I blame the staff for that. So do a better job, because you can't have these video images of the president tripping or the president going the wrong way. I think.
Thank you. Now a little bit of Stuart Varney.
All right, now this. A newly revealed email from 2015 shows what Hunter Biden's, quote, ultimate purpose was with the Ukrainian company Burisma. All right, Loeren, take us through it.
This was an email from Burisma executive to Hunter when Hunter was on its board, and this is what it reads. Pull it up. Quote, the scope of work should also include organization of a visit of a number of widely recognized and influential current and or former U.S. policymakers to Ukraine in November, with the ultimate purpose to close down for any cases or pursuits against the Burisma president Nikolai in Ukraine. Well, that influential policymaker was Vice President Joe Biden, Ashley, and he did go to Kyiv 1 month after that email, and he threatened to withhold $1 billion in U.S. aid if Ukraine's top prosecutor investigating that Burisma executive was not fired. Some Republicans are calling that clear proof of extortion and bribery.
So this is an example of transparency and being part of the cult of neutrality. She is trying to pretend that she's neutral on this. Some Republicans say, I don't care what some Republicans say. What I want to know is this indeed proof of bribery and corruption? And that's what she should say. She should say, this is obviously proof of bribery and corruption, not some Republicans say, and as she tries to maintain some type of transparency. She's not transparent. She's an American citizen. She has a skin in the game, so to speak. She has a stake in this matter. She is, again, she cannot hide and pretend that she is neutral. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now the rape of the mind.
Political conditioning. Political conditioning should not be confused with training or persuasion or even indoctrination. It is more than that. It is taming. It is taking possession of both the simplest and the most complicated nervous patterns of man. It is the battle for the possession of the nerve cells. It is coercion and enforced conversion. Instead of conditioning man to an unbiased facing of reality, the seducer conditions him to catchwords, verbal stereotypes, slogans, formulas, symbols. Pavlovian strategy in the totalitarian sense means imprinting prescribed reflexes on the mind that has been broken down. The totalitarian wants first the required response from the nerve cells, then control of the individual, and finally, control of the masses. The system starts with verbal conditioning and training by combining the required stereotypes with negative or positive stimuli, pain or reward. In the POW camps in Korea, where there was individual and mass brainwashing, the negative and positive conditioning stimuli were usually hunger and food. The moment the soldier conformed to the party line, his food ration was improved. Say yes, and I'll give you a piece of candy. The whole gamut of negative stimuli, as we saw them in the Schwabel case, consists of physical pressure, moral pressure, fatigue, hunger, boring repetition, confusion by seemingly logical syllogisms. Many victims of totalitarianism have told me in interviews that the most upsetting experience they faced in the concentration camp was the feeling of loss of logic, the state of confusion into which they had been brought, the state in which nothing had any validity. They had arrived at the Pavlovian state of inhibition, which psychiatrists call mental disintegration or depersonalization. It seemed as if they had unlearned all their former responses and had not yet adapted new ones. But in reality, they simply did not know what was what. The Pavlovian theory translated into a political method as a way of leveling the mind, the Nazis called it Gleichschaltung, is the stock in trade of totalitarian countries. Some psychiatric points are of interest because we see that Pavlovian training can be used successfully only when special mental conditions prevail. In order to tame people into the desired pattern, victims must be brought to a point where they have lost their alert consciousness and mental awareness. Freedom of discussion and free intellectual exchange hinder conditioning. Feelings of terror, feelings of fear and hopelessness, of being alone, of standing with one's back to the wall must be instilled. The treatment of the American prisoners of war in the Korean POW camps followed just such a pattern. They were compelled to listen to lectures and other forms of daily word barrage. The very fact that they did not understand the lectures and were bored by the long sessions inhibited their democratic training and conditioned them to swallow passively the bitter doctrinal diet. For the prisoners were subjected not only to a political training program, but also to an involuntary taming program. To some degree, the communist propaganda lectures were directed toward retraining the prisoners' minds. This training our soldiers could reject, but the endless repetitions and the constant sloganizing, together with the physical hardships and deprivations the prisoners suffered, caused an unconscious taming and conditioning against which only previously built-up inner strength and awareness could help. There is still another reason why our soldiers were sometimes trapped by the communist conditioning. Experiments with animals and experiences with human beings have taught us that threat, tension, and anxiety in general may accelerate the establishment of conditioned responses, particularly when those responses tend to diminish fear and panic. Spence and Farber. The emergency of prison camp life and mental torture provide ideal circumstances for such conditioning. The responses can develop even when the victim is completely unaware that he is being influenced. Thus, many of our soldiers developed automatic responses of which they remained completely unconscious. Segal. But this is only one side of the coin. Her experience has also shown that people who know what to expect under conditions of mental pressure can develop a so-called perceptual defense, which protects them from being influenced. This means that the more familiar people are with the concepts of thought control and menticide, the more they understand the nature of the propaganda barrage directed against them, the more inner resistance they can put up, even though inevitably some of the Inquisitor's suggestions will leak through the barrier of conscious mental defense. Our understanding of the conditioning process leads us also to an understanding of some of the paradoxical reactions found among victims of concentration camps and other prisoners. Often those with a rigid, simple belief were better able to withstand the continual barrage against their minds than were the flexible, sophisticated ones, full of doubt and inner conflict. The simpler man with deep-rooted, freely absorbed religious faith could exert a much greater inner resistance than could the complex, questioning intellectualist. The refined intellectual is much more handicapped by the internal pros and cons. In the totalitarian countries, where belief in Pavlovian strategy has assumed grotesque proportions, the self-thinking, subjective man has disappeared. There is an utter rejection of any attempt at persuasion or discussion. Individual self-expression is taboo. Private affection is taboo. Peaceful exchange of thoughts and free conversation will disturb the conditioned reflexes and therefore taboo. No longer are there any brains, only conditioned patterns and educated muscles. In such a taming system, neurotic compulsion is looked upon as a positive asset instead of something pathological. The mental automation becomes the ideal of education. Yet the Soviet theoreticians themselves are often unaware of this, and many of them do not realize the dire consequences of subjecting man to a completely mechanistic conditioning. They themselves are often just as frightened as we are by the picture of the perfectly functioning human robot. This is what one of their psychologists says. The entire reactionary nature of this approach to man is completely clear. Man is an automaton who can be caused to act as one wills. This is the ideal of capitalism. Behold the dream of capitalism the world over, a working class without consciousness, which cannot think for itself, whose actions can be trained according to the whim of the exploiter. This is the reason why it is in America, the bulwark of present-day capitalism, that the theory of man as a robot has been so vigorously developed and so stubbornly held to. Bauer. Western psychology and psychiatry, although acknowledging its debt to Pavlov as a great pioneer who made important contributions to our understanding of behavior, takes a much less mechanical view of man than do the Soviet Pavlovians. It is apparent to us that their simple explanation of training ignores and rejects the concept of purposeful adaptation and the question of the goals to which this training is directed. Western experimental psychologists tend to see the conditioned reflex as developing fully only in the service of gratifying basic instinctual needs or of avoiding pain. That is, only when the whole organism is concerned in the activity. In the complicated process of response to the world, conscious and especially unconscious drives and motivations play a role, as Freud taught us. All training, of which the conditioned response is only one example, is an automation of actions which were originally consciously learned and thought over. The ideal of Western democratic psychology is to train man into independence and maturity by enlisting their conscious aid, awareness, and volition in the learning process. The ideal of the totalitarian psychology, on the other hand, is to tame men, to make them willing tools in the hands of their leaders. Like training, taming has the purpose of making actions automatic. Unlike training, it does not require the conscious participation of the learner. Both training and taming are energy and time-saving devices, and in both, the mystery of the psyche is hidden in the purposefulness of the response. The automation of functions in man saves him expenditure of energy, but can make him weaker when encountering new, unexpected challenges. Cultural routinization and habit formation by local rules and myths make of everybody a partial automaton. National and racial prejudices are acted out unwittingly. Group hatred often bursts out almost automatically when triggered by slogans and catchwords. In the totalitarian world, this narrow disciplinarian conditioning is done more perfectly and more ad absurdum.
And that was Political Conditioning from The Rape of the Mind by Joost-meerlo, M.D. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now, Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I again remind Congress that Ukraine is not the 51st state of America. This is not a NATO ally, and this is our National Defense Authorization Act for our nation, for the United States of America, which 50 states. I'd also like to remind Congress that the Department of Defense has failed its audit every single year, year over year. And last year alone, they could not account for over 61% of their assets. The Department of Defense is not doing a good job with the money that Congress allows for it to have for our nation's defense. And I think that it's important, again, for everyone in Congress to realize the American people don't work hard every single day to pay for other countries' borders to be defended. They want our border defended. And we have 300 Americans dying every single day from fentanyl poisoning that's coming from China and the Mexican cartels. If our Department of Defense wants to defend America, we should be defending our border and not proclaiming our righteousness, talking about a war in Ukraine. With that.
And that was Rep. Marjorie Taylor Greene. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now from Rep. Loeren Boebert, a tweet. I was proud to support Ronnie Jackson's effort to defend the Department of Defense's abortion travel policy. Taxpayer dollars should not go to flying women around the country to get abortions. Subsidizing abortions violates the Hyde Amendment, full stop. And again, that was Representative Loeren Boebert. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now Marjorie Taylor Greene, representative, being interviewed on Newsmax about the American people's trust in the FBI.
The FBI shouldn't be paying employees to cover, or other companies, to cover up a crime. And that's what the FBI did under Christopher Wray's leadership, is they covered up a crime, and it was all evidence available for everyone to see on Hunter Biden's laptop. And there was so much more information and more information coming out about the Biden crime family. But that is who the FBI is today. They're a politically weaponized organization that's funded by the taxpayers.
Think about this for a second, folks. We're watching Christopher Wray, who's the head of the FBI. His boss is Attorney General Merrick Garland, also in the tank, clearly. Where are we? American people must be going, if we can't trust the FBI and the Department of Justice, who can we trust?
Well, that's exactly right. And that's what I hear every time I go back to my district and all across the country. People do not trust the FBI. They do not trust the Department of Justice. And that is extremely sad to me, as I'm sure it is to you. But that's why we have tools in Congress. We have the Holman Rule, where we can completely zero out their salaries. And we also have the powerful tool of impeachment. This is something I've talked about, and I've introduced articles of impeachment on Christopher Wray and Merrick Garland, because I'm a business owner, Eric, and I believe in firing people. And the American people know exactly what that's like, because it's a reality in the private sector that does not exist here in the unrealistic land of government.
And that was Newsmax interviewing Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene. And when she's talking about firing and being on the outside and all that, that is so true. And but the government and the people in it, particularly FBI Director Christopher Wray, think that they have rights, that the government has rights, that the government has the right to investigations, that it has the right to arrest, to prosecute, to incarcerate, and it does not. The government has no rights. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene introducing articles of impeachment against Christopher Wray.
Director Wray has turned the Federal Bureau of Investigation into the personal police force of Joe Biden and Attorney General Merrick Garland. It is wholly unacceptable for the FBI director or any civil officer to use their power in a way that targets one political class and favors another. Wray has used Soviet-style tactics in his targeting of average Americans and placed threat tags on everyone from pro-life groups to traditional Catholics. He even sent armed agents to the home of President Donald Trump, who is also the current frontrunner in the Republican presidential election, in a politically motivated raid to influence an upcoming election, all while shielding the current Democrat president's vile son from a criminal probe. Wray is using his extremely powerful law enforcement role for political purposes. He must be impeached.
And that was Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene introducing articles of impeachment against FBI Director Christopher Wray. Good for her. Good for her doing something, not just holding hearings, but actually introducing articles of impeachment. And every representative in Congress, Democrat or Republican, should support it. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now, Rob Schmitt tonight from Newsmax.
Right. All right, Congressman James Comer joins me now exclusively with a big update from his committee, especially after what we heard today. House Oversight announcing a hearing next week, a week from today, with the two IRS whistleblowers, Gary Shapley and, of course, Whistleblower X. Congressman, good to have you back on. We're very familiar with Gary Shapley on this show. We talk about him a lot. The other whistleblower has been described as a gay Democrat. I'm wondering, will his identity be revealed? Will all this be televised when you guys have this hearing?
It's going to be televised. We hope Newsmax will cover it. America's going to get to see who witness X is. And I think that both witnesses are going to have a wealth of information that they're going to be able to share with the House Oversight Committee. We have bank records. We have bank violations. We have very specific tax questions to ask these whistleblowers. And what we've learned from the transcript that they gave with the Ways and Means Committee, these two IRS employees knew a lot more than I would have ever dreamed about the Bidens and all the corruption that's taken place with all the shell companies and the various different bank accounts. They didn't know about all the shell companies, Rob, because they were told to stand down by the Department of Justice, but they knew about at least a third of them. So we've got some very specific questions, and I think that America's going to get to see firsthand just how involved Joe Biden was in the family's shenanigans and just how corrupt what the Bidens were doing was.
Right, and just to remind our viewers, is that when they started blowing the whistle on the IRS, basically trying to shut this down and give Hunter this sweetheart deal, they blew the whistle and they were removed from the case, which talk about obstruction of justice. You're now demanding an unredacted copy of the FBI report made after the 2019 interviews with Gal Luft in Belgium. Luft claims that Biden took huge amounts of money from the Chinese for beneficial policy decisions here in the United States. It is the most damning claim that we've seen, and you're looking for more information from the FBI. Tell us about that.
Well, Gal Luft worked for the same company that the Bidens worked for, CEFC. But yet the Department of Justice indicted Gal Luft for being an unregistered foreign agent. Now, I'm not saying that was the wrong thing for the Department of Justice to do. Right. I just think it's odd considering Hunter Biden worked for the same company and was paid about 25 times more than Luft. But Luft knows exactly what CEFC was. He knew exactly what role the Bidens played in it, including Joe Biden. And the reason Gal Luft is important to our investigation, Rob, is he's one of the few people in the United States who actually was also on the payroll with the Bidens. So the Bidens have never answered the question, what did you do to receive the millions of dollars that your family got from China? Gal Luft may have the answer to that. So he's a very important witness to us, and I just find it shocking that the day he turns up, the day he records that video to Miranda Devine at the New York Post, the Department of Justice unseals this indictment, and they indicted him for the same thing that I thought Hunter Biden should have been indicted for years ago.
Let's just face the very obvious facts. They're caught. They're caught. The DOJ is caught. It's all been caught. You have to be deaf, dumb, and blind to not understand this story. It's the most obvious thing I can imagine. Congressman Comer, thanks for the update tonight. We look forward to the hearing next week. Good to see you, sir.
Thanks for having me, Rob.
And that was Newsmax with Representative James Comer. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, Inside Delta Force by Eric L. Haney, Command Sergeant Major, U.S. Army, retired. And this is in the beginning, and this is going to be part 2. And this is where we're going to get some details about the selection process for Delta Force that he went through.
Forming a brand new outfit and creating new operating methods is an NCO's dream come true. But still, I was apprehensive. There was a lot of unknown here, not the least of which was what I would do if I failed to make it through the selection program. I had turned my platoon over to Tom Duke, the new platoon sergeant. Duke was a solid, experienced leader who had been with us for a year. I had come to know and respect him in that time, so I knew the men would be in good hands no matter what. As it became known I was going to Fort Bragg, my troops wished me well and told me, if anyone can make it into that new unit, you can, Sergeant Haney. Man, They were going to be a hard bunch to face if I came back a failure. In my favor, I had been in the Army 8 years. I was a seasoned and experienced infantryman. I had successfully attended 2 of the hardest courses in the military, Ranger School and the Jump Master course. I had been a platoon sergeant for more than 4 years, with the last 2 of those years in the Rangers. Life in the Rangers was austere. In fact, it was downright severe. If there were 2 ways of accomplishing a given task, we always took the hard way. We never took shortcuts, and we never spared any effort. We spent at least 3 weeks of every month in the field and deployed on extended training to the Arctic, the desert, and the jungle 3 times a year. We were also subject to 2 no-notice exercises annually and participated in major Army or NATO programs every year. Life in the Rangers was so difficult that most men failed to complete a full 2-year tour with the unit, and numerous injuries also winnowed the ranks. But it was good preparation for accomplishing other, still more difficult tasks. I was determined to give this new challenge my utmost effort, and if that wasn't good enough, I would at least have the satisfaction of knowing I had tried. Small satisfaction, but some. I had almost no idea of what to expect on the morning of 13 September 1978, when I loaded my pickup, kissed my family goodbye, and set out on the 5-hour drive up I-95 from Hunter Army Airfield in Savannah, Georgia, for Fort Bragg, North Carolina, and points unknown. I merely reminded myself that the future is always perfect, and wished it to be so. Some Army posts have a real beauty about them. The Presidio of Monterey and the main post areas of Forts McClellan and Benning are a few that come to mind, principally because of the Spanish colonial architecture of the old buildings. Fort Stewart has magnificent live oaks and cypresses draped in Spanish moss. But I can't think of a single aesthetic recommendation for Fort Bragg. It is about as drab and unappealing a spot as you can find in North America. The post sprawls over the sandhills of North Carolina. It was established on near worthless land as an artillery training center during World War I. The land is sparsely covered with straggly pines and stunted scrub oak trees. The layout of the cantonment areas, the places where people live, seems haphazard. The whole place has a temporary, transient feel about it. But it is the home of the airborne, and as such contains the 82nd Airborne Division, the Special Forces Center and schools, 5th and 7th Special Forces Groups, 18th Airborne Corps Headquarters, and the 1st Corps Support Command. There were also some smaller miscellaneous organizations scattered in odd, hidden corners around post. One of these was 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment, Delta. I pulled into the parking lot of Moon Hall on the main post of Fort Bragg shortly before noon. I made my way into the lobby and saw a sign directing me to 1st SFOD D. I followed the arrow to the left and saw a man wearing unmarked fatigues sitting at a desk in a small room. "Here for selection, Sarge?" he asked. "Yes, I am." "Well, find your name and sign in here," he said as he indicated a roster on the desk and handed me a pen. I eyed him surreptitiously while I found my name and wrote my signature next to it. He was about 40 years old, soft-spoken and good-looking. He wasn't exactly what I had expected to meet. The first person you usually encounter when signing into a new unit is some foul-tempered clerk, a person who, with all the power of a petty czar, seems to believe he has been ordained by God Almighty to spread irritation to every man he meets. This man was not that at all. "You won't be staying here. You'll be going to Aberdeen camp. Have you ever been there before?" he asked as he looked me directly in the eyes. When I told him that I had not, he handed me a strip map and explained how to find the place. It was on the western edge of post, about 30 miles away. "Do you have a POV, privately owned vehicle, or do you need transportation?" "No, I have my own vehicle." He detached one sheet from the ream of orders I had given him. "Okay, Ranger. When you arrive at Aberdeen, park out front and report to the man at the gate. He'll square you away." and as he handed me the rest of the orders, he said with a slight smile in his voice and on his face, "You have a good one, and I hope to see you later." "Thanks," I replied. "I hope so too." I took my time driving out to the camp. Aberdeen was what I expected it to be, an isolation camp. These are small, out-of-the-way places a unit can stay while planning for a deployment or mission, a secure spot offering refuge from the normal distractions of life. They will have rustic barracks, a mess hall, orderly room, and offices for staff sections, a supply building and warehousing, a small motor pool, a landing zone for a few helicopters, and maybe a range for zeroing and test-firing weapons. I was waved inside the gate and parked in the lot nearby. The guy at the gate walked over as I was getting out of my truck. He was in fatigues without a name tag or insignia of any kind. He stuck out his hand as we approached. "Hello, Sergeant Haney. Glad to have you here. Take your gear down to Barracks A and grab a bunk. Then find Sergeant Major Shoemate. He'll get your equipment issued to you. Chow is at 17:30. Instructions for tomorrow will be posted on the board outside the mess hall. See you later. Have a good one." "Okay, thanks," I replied as I shouldered my kit bag and rucksack and turned in the direction of the barracks. The barracks were the standard tropical hooches, low-frame buildings 24 feet wide and 72 feet long, concrete floors and tin roofs with wide overhanging eaves. The upper halves of the walls were hinged on top and propped open at a 45-degree angle to serve as windows. The open windows were screened. A row of GI cots ran down each side of the building, and a string of bare light bulbs hung from the center line of the exposed rafters. Not a bad home at all. I went about halfway down the building, found a bunk on the left side, and dropped my bags. My idea was to get away from the door and avoid as much traffic and stirred-up dust as I could. There were 8 or 10 other men in the hooch. Their shoulder patches showed them to be from overseas units or from some of the forts out west. I nodded to the ones who looked up as I went out to find the sergeant major. I stepped out the door and took my bearings. There was a warehouse-looking building near the motor pool, probably a good place to start. About halfway there, I met a guy hurrying up the sidewalk. "Hey, bud, do you know where I can find Sergeant Major Shoemate?" I asked. "Yeah, that's him over by the Deuce and a Half." He pointed to a man with his shirt open and his hat on the back of his head, standing next to an Army 2.5-ton truck. "Okay, if you say so." I started over to see this alleged Sergeant Major. Sergeants Major are the walking, breathing embodiment of everything that's right in the U.S. Army. This guy looked like Joe Shit the Ragman. His shirt was wide open, and he wore no t-shirt. His dog tags were gold-plated. His hat was tipped up on the back of his head, and he wore a huge, elaborately curled and waxed handlebar mustache. There was trickery of some kind here. The only thing I expected on this trip was the unexpected. So if this was a game, I figured I'd play along and see what happened. I stepped 3 paces in front of the man, slammed to a halt, and from the rigid position of parade rest, barked, "Sergeant Major, I was told to see you and draw some equipment." He eyed me for a second or so, as the wrinkles of a grin crawled from beneath his mustache to settle around his eyes. "Goddamn, Ranger, relax a little bit, will you? This ain't no promotion board. You keep that shit up, you're gonna wear me out." His voice was rumbling and rich, with a tinge of the hills deep within. It was force of habit. In the Rangers, when you addressed a more senior NCO, you stood at parade rest. I relaxed slightly to the position of at ease. "That's a little better," he said. His grin widened. He didn't seem to be making fun of me, just surprised at being addressed in such a formal manner. "Go over to the supply shack, get yourself a bag of junk, and sign your name on the roster at the door. Don't worry about getting it too clean when you turn it in. Everybody knows my standards ain't very high." Christ almighty, this was shaping up to be a strange place. I hustled down to the supply shack, signed for a bag of equipment, and talked to the guy on duty while I checked the contents of the bag against the equipment list. Is that guy up there really a sergeant major? Shoemate? Yeah, he really is. He's the sergeant major in charge of selection. Well, he's certainly different from any sergeant major I've ever met before. He's different from any human being you've ever met before. Sergeant Major Walter J. Shoemate was a living legend in Special Forces. An old veteran who had entered the Army during the Korean War, he had seen and done it all. At 44, he was the oldest man to ever make it through Delta Force selection, and he was invaluable to the formation of the unit. Shoemate added an element of humanity that could have very well eluded the organization in those critical early years. Without his special touch and unique influence, the outfit could have easily taken on an apparatchik-like attitude. But with Shoemate around, no matter how special you thought you were, he could always convince you that you were still just a human being. Walt was serious about soldiering, but he was the antithesis of an automaton. Barracks A was starting to fill up when I returned. So far, everyone was from somewhere other than Fort Bragg. There were a few guys I knew from various courses we had attended together, and 2 I had served with in other units. As large as the Army was in those days, I had been around long enough that I knew someone no matter where I went. A few guys were loudly expounding their expertise on special operations and counterterrorism, CT, as I walked down the aisle to my bunk. Trying to impress each other and playing to the crowd. Very little knowledge and a lot of talk. 1st Ranger Battalion had been working for almost a year with the Army's interim CT force, Blue Light, trying to develop techniques for combating terrorist action. Both units had worked pretty hard at the tasking, but after a couple of joint exercises and thorough after-action analysis, it was apparent we weren't making much headway. In fact, the last exercise had gone so badly that our battalion commander had been relieved of command. So far, no one was very expert at what it would take to engage and defeat terrorism. A guy was sitting on the bunk next to mine unpacking his kit bag. He looked up as I put my equipment down. Our eyes met, and we both put out a hand. Kiki Science, 3-7 Special Forces, Panama, he told me with a slight Hispanic accent. We shook hands. Eric Haney, 1st Ranger. Mucho gusto en conocerle, Kiki, I replied. El gusto es mío, he returned with a smile. Kiki was a medium-sized guy with the wiry, muscled build of a runner. His hair was thick but short, and he wore a pencil-thin Puerto Rican band leader mustache. He looked to be about my age, 26 or so. He had the air of a tough, competent soldier. Kiki, y'all heard much about this outfit down in Panama? I asked as I sorted my equipment. Probably not much more than you have, he said. My company was tasked by Cincy Southcom, Commander-in-Chief, Southern Command, with working up a CT program for the Latin American theater, but we haven't had any more success than you guys in Blue Light. And everything about this group has been very close hold. One of our guys made it here in the spring, but no one's heard anything from him since. We had one tryout too, last spring, I said, but he was back after the first week and he won't say a word. So far, information has been pretty tight. I guess we'll find out what we need to know as we go along. Ojalá, he said, turning back to his gear. Sí, ojalá. Yes, God willing indeed.
And that was part 2 of In the Beginning from Inside Delta Force by Eric L. Haney, Command Sergeant Major, retired. Back in a minute. Thank you. I'm Ron, your host and the only true conservative in the United States today, bidding adios to all of the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. And until next time, be honest, be smart, be beautiful, and remember that the left has no authority, no power, and they can't win.